Welcome everyone to the Fellows Colloquium series at the Hutchins Center. And today we are honored to host fellow Mark Burford. He is R.P. Wallenberg Professor of Music at Reed College. His research and teaching focus on 20th century African-American music history and 19th century European concert music. His scholarship has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals. His article, Sam Cooke as Pop Album Artist, A Reinvention in 3 Songs, received the Society for American Music's 2012 Irving Lowens Award for the Outstanding Article on American Music. His book, Mahalia Jackson and the Black Gospel Field, received the 2019 Otto Kinkledye Award from the American Musicological Society for the Outstanding Book in Musicology. Professor Burford also presents his work to general audiences. He has provided essays for productions at the San Francisco Opera, contributed to the Women's Song Forum blog, and appeared on the podcasts Aria Code and All Music is Black Music podcasts. Please welcome Mark Burford.
Thank you very much, Krishna, and to Tom and Velma and Matt and all the other people who made this arrival so smooth. Also, of course, to Skip and Abby for the opportunity to be here, this inspiring opportunity on the campus and at the Institute, and to be part of a cohort of scholars I'm enjoying getting to know and learning from, and for this chance to kind of take the lid off a new project and share some of my work. So I look forward to being in conversation about that. I'm gonna share screen now. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. And I'm going to be talking about the crisis, but before I start, I should acknowledge that this image you're looking at is both misleading because there wasn't an actual crisis cover that looked like this, and also a bit gratuitous because I don't talk about this image in my talk, but it is relevant. It's a studio photo taken in 1894 of Frederick Douglass and his grandson, Joseph Douglass, who was a conservatory trained concert violinist, and his career was covered actually quite closely in the crisis. In fact, he's referenced in the very first issue of the magazine. And I've also learned kind of tangentially that Douglass himself was a self-taught amateur violinist who was a hobbyist who played around the house at family gatherings and on his own. But this is just an example of the literally hundreds of stories that I've been stumbling across doing this work. One small I'll share with you today. So at my home institution, Reed College, I teach Du Bois nearly every year, most often in conjunction with a class I teach called Music and the Black Freedom Struggle, where I assign the final 2 chapters assign the final 2 chapters of The Souls of Black Folk, both of which are music related. The short story of the coming of John and Du Bois's kind of hermeneutic rumination on the spirituals of the sorrow songs. And teaching these chapters year after year while registering Du Bois's other intersections with music led me to wonder how and why he held music so close throughout his life and career, and eventually to ask, in my new research project, how might we characterize and fully assess the stakes of making and listening to music in Du Bois's intellectual output and political activism? Going into this project, I realized I'd have to either engage or maneuver around 2 significant set pieces. The first is the question of Du Bois's personal musical taste, which has commonly been understood as skewing conservative, and more specifically toward 2 bodies of music commonly endowed with idealist aesthetic value: classical music and folk song. Du Bois fell in love with the operas of Richard Wagner in the 1890s as a graduate student in Germany, And beyond his Sorrow Songs essay, he researched and occasionally lectured publicly on Black folk music. This photo of a piano lesson, part of the album Negro Life in Georgia, compiled by Du Bois for the American Negro exhibit at the 1900 Paris exhibition, is often Exhibit A when representing the domestic gentility, class exclusivity, and tone deafness to more commercial Black popular idioms that's typically associated with Du Bois's musical outlook. It also raises a second question that I needed to account for. If Du Bois's musical orientation has been cast as leaning toward classical music or classicized folk song, Black classical music making itself has habitually been inseparable from what's commonly referred to as a politics of respectability. Now, increasingly, the story is being told in more nuanced ways, thanks to a current surge in scholarship on Black classical music, including a bumper crop of work on Florence Price and Marian Anderson, recent and forthcoming biographies on Harry Burleigh, William Dawson, and Margaret Bonds, Naomi Andre's influential work on Black opera, Kira Thurman's new book on Black concert musicians in Germany, and the research on Jim Crow practices in classical music by Harvard musicologist Carol. But I do think that there remains a stubborn, if implicit, tendency to start with the premise that formally trained Black musicians in the early 20th century were first and foremost agents of the behavioral agendas of respectability and uplift. Put another way, African Americans and classical music is often cast as a conundrum of African Americans in classical music. Black musicians and Black people seeking to occupy an existing category for the purpose of class differentiating cultural capital, tokenizing vindication, uplift suasion, or hand-me-down whiteness. I was struck by this trope very forcefully when recently, in the middle of this research, I listened to a podcast on Harry Pace's Black Swan Records. This was the first Black-owned and run record label founded in 1921, and actually named by Pace's mentor, Du Bois, who was also a board member. I heard many scholars, in the midst of what was, in fact, a pretty pro-Black narrative, characterize the idea of Black classical music as bound up with Du Bois's own taste biases.
And Du Bois was an elitist.
As ideologically tainted.
This is classic talents and tense stuff. Uplift the race by trying to encourage people to listen to better music, quality music.
And even as disposable, hold your nose ephemera.
A lot of the Black Swan material is boring as to be honest, because it's just this hoity-toity, white, light, classical crap. But I get why he recorded it, because the idea is to show that Black people could do that too.
Now, in fact, though Pace did want to document Black Carusos, Black Swan had a multifaceted game plan, as their two full-page ads in The Crisis announcing the launch of the company's show, offering everything from opera to the blues. So the podcast's representation of the birth of Black Swan, which is characteristic, I think, of other discourse on Black classical music making of the period, flattens out the true extent of Pace's ambition in order to foreground a particular set of ulterior motives. So in light of these common narratives, the starting point I chose for thinking about Du Bois and music has been to study coverage of music in The Crisis, the NAACP magazine that Du Bois edited from its founding in 1910 until 1934, which has actually helped me to navigate these set pieces in part by treating them as separable questions. So as I hope to show, zeroing in on music coverage in The Crisis, and at this point I've only gotten through the first half of the Du Bois years, is productive, I think, because it untethers us from the question of the singularity of Du Bois's personal tastes and directs our attention toward the diversity of the musical lives and musical sound that we encounter on the pages of the magazine. And similarly, the habitual preface of uplift and especially respectability loosens its grip when we're committed to a more fundamental accounting of the embodied activity by Black musicians and their advocates that was within the orbit of crisis coverage. And I want to be clear that my intent is not to respond to these separable questions, however worthy they may be of our of exploration. I'm not invested in establishing or debunking Du Bois as a cultural snob or in rendering a judgment on early 20th century Black classical music vis-a-vis respectability politics. My real interest is in getting into the weeds a bit and try to escape the immediate gravitational pull and claustrophobia of such placeholders as elitism, respectability, or even classical music, and create sufficient breathing room to consider other possible ways of thinking about a subset of Black music making and Black institution building during the first decade or so of the crisis. So first, a quick word about the crisis for those who aren't familiar with it. Du Bois took a first crack at magazine editing when he founded the short-lived magazines Moon Illustrated Weekly in 1905 and The Horizon in 1907. But in 1909, a group of progressive white philanthropists and social reformers, in collaboration with Black leaders such as Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and William Monroe Trotter, founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And after some coaxing, Du Bois was persuaded to leave his position at Atlanta University to become the NAACP's full-time New York-based director of publications and research. And it was in this capacity that he founded and launched the monthly magazine, The Crisis, a Record of the Darker Races. Du Bois was unequivocal about the fact that taking on the editorship of The Crisis marked a strategic turn from objective academic scholarship to purposeful propaganda created by generating and interpreting fresh data about Black America. Music shows up in a range of places in the magazine. We encounter it most abundantly in its monthly digest of Black arts activity, but it also crops up in features on successful musicians, in critical commentary reprinted from other sources, in published poetry and fiction, in photographs, and in advertisements. The Crisis regularly ran paid music-related ads by HBCUs and Black-owned conservatories pitching their music programs, companies selling the latest sheet music and phonograph records, and musicians offering their services as performers or teachers. So here's an example of the latter. This is an ad by a performing ensemble identified as the Greater Invincible Concert Company, and they sometimes went as the Invincible Four, led by the two men pictured, both of whom were blind, Edward Mackey to the left and James Johnson to the right. And this version of the group included Mackey's wife, Edmonia, and his daughter, Dorothy. Here's a slightly better image of the photo. And I love this picture for a couple of reasons. Part of the Invincible shtick as performers was that they were, let's just say, radical multi-instrumentalists. In this photo alone, there are 18 different instruments, and one report claimed that between the four of them, they played 34 instruments, including piano. And in case you're wondering about those two kind of wild-looking instruments in the front to the left and right, those are harp guitars, which combine fretted and unfretted strings. But what I love is the contrast between the prim, concert-ready appearance of the musicians and the slight untidiness of the instruments posed with them, almost like a teenager's messy room. And I like the fact that their musical dexterity as individuals and as a group is what's being pitched here. But I'm also intrigued by the prominent phrase high-class entertainers. Their acts seem to have been built around the instrument shuffle suggested by the photo, which would have enabled them to deliver pop songs, early jazz, string band music, light classics, and perhaps various other styles. But it also included singing, dancing, and joke-telling that betray Mackey and Johnson's prior work on the vaudeville circuit in the context of blackface minstrelsy. So there are a number of reasons why the Invincible Four, a working band rebranded as a production company, might have wanted to assure Crisis readers, who they obviously viewed as potential audience, that they're a high-class outfit. So it's noticeable, for instance, that in this ad, they feature operatic voices, a violinist, and an elocutionist, which is what a reader is, which they didn't mention in earlier versions of their Crisis ads. But I can't help but imagine some of my students coming across an ad like this, seeing the words high class in an NAACP publication, and instinctively have it fulfill their expectations of uplift ideology before accounting for the multiple layers of what we're actually seeing in these musicians. So I actually know very little about this difficult to categorize group, but musicians in an ad like this present us with questions that may require us to roll up our sleeves and inquire a little bit further. Some crisis ads can be read in counterpoint with the magazine's core content. These two ads appeared side by side in December 1918. One is for recordings and performance bookings by tenor Roland Hayes, who was the most accomplished Black classical musician of the day and probably the most covered musician in the crisis. And the other is for sheet music, published by the Pace and Handy Company, Pace and Handy Music Company, run by Harry Pace, later of Black Swan Records, and W.C. Handy. And we might note the juxtaposition of classical music and an eclectic assortment of pop music that includes marches, rags, waltzes, blues, and ballads, and how Pace and Handy not only offers the latest hits, but also explicitly links the act of consumption with a race-proud endorsement of Negro brains and Negro capital. I'm also struck by how Pace and Handy glorifies Handy. They call him the most remarkable musician the race has yet produced, the originator of the blues style of composition on which new and distinctively American music has been founded. But Handy had already been highlighted in the crisis 3 years earlier when he was featured in its Men of the Month section in a write-up that explained how Handy contributed to the world an entirely new style of music composition, despite the fact that he'd never had a music lesson in his life. So you get the sense that Pace and Handy are picking up this gift-wrapped headline, a Black vernacular songwriter who was not just the father of the blues, but also the progenitor of a distinctly American school of composition, which suggests how, despite Du Bois's adamant insistence that paid ads were entirely independent from editorial content, that for readers, there was often an inescapable dialogue between these parts of the magazine. Here's one more ad that's notable because it's in fact placed by the crisis itself in the name of its merchandise distribution arm, the Dunbar Company. So as a musicologist familiar with conventional Eurocentric music historical narratives built around musical masterpieces, I instinctively, at first glance, thought that the bold heading Music of the Masters was gesturing in that direction. But we're quickly told that what's being offered is the latest and best musical compositions produced by Negro writers. And in fact, close reading of the ad copy shows not only that the masters in question are all Black, though less surprisingly all men, but also that the cultural capital drawn upon is not the prestige of venerable concert music, but recent popularity and what instinctively appeals to Black consumers. As the ad reads, many of the tuneful melodies that you hear on the stage and in big musical comedies of vaudeville, and afterward hum or whistle, are composed by colored men. And many composers who enjoy national reputations and whose names are familiar to you as songwriters are Negroes, who for business reasons cannot boast of their racial identity. And even as the ad baits the hook with pop cultural cachet, it offers an eclectic cohort of musicians who range stylistically and in terms of training. The list includes the classical composers Samuel Coleridge Taylor and Harry Burleigh, formerly trained crossover musicians who made their names writing musical theater scores, Will Marion Cook, J. Rosamond Johnson, and William H. Tyers, successful vaudeville songwriters Bob Cole and Chris Smith, the influential military band leaders James Reese Europe and Nathaniel Clark Smith, and prolific pop lyricists Alex Rogers and Cecil Mack, along with the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, who wrote the libretto for the landmark Williams and Walker musical In Dahomey. So what I'd like to point out here is how this crisis ad from 1913 very shrewdly, but I think unmistakably, turned habitually understood notions of musical masterpieces on their head with a reimagined Music of the Masters offering for sale published sheet music that brought together, as the ad describes them, old plantation melodies, classical numbers, and the latest ragtime. And to me, this strategy represents less an attempt to claim the cultural capital of an existing classical canon of musical masters than a total rebuilding of that category from the ground up, jarring our expectations not only with a fresh pantheon of names, but also through a self-determined configuration of styles, genres, and performance contexts. I know when I first encountered this ad, which slyly presents Black song as the master's music, it hit me with a genuine sense of surprise that felt both tongue-in-cheek and deeply subversive. One thing to bear in mind when discussing coverage of music in the crisis is the question of authorial voice, of who is writing what we're reading. Du Bois always insisted that the crisis under his stewardship would be driven by his own voice. In his 1940 autobiography, The Dusk of Dawn, he wrote, "I determined to make the opinion of the crisis a personal opinion," adding, "The crisis would state openly the opinion of the editor, so long, of course, that as that opinion was in general agreement with that of the organization." The only people credited on the masthead were Du Bois, Jesse Fawcett, the literary editor, and Du Bois's protege and business partner, Augustus Granville Dill, who was also a musician, by the way. He was a organist and a choir director in New Jersey. So there's often a temptation, one I've often fallen prey to myself, to cite unattributed crisis content as if Du Bois himself were speaking almost like a ventriloquist. A lot of coverage of music appeared in a regular department of the magazine called Along the Color Line, later renamed The Horizon, which Du Bois described as the monthly history of the Negro race. In the early years of the magazine, Along the Color Line opened each issue and included a robust music and art subsection dominated by music. Du Bois confessed in Souls, "I know little of music and can say nothing in technical phrase." So he mostly outsourced the nitty-gritty musical news to a respected and admired associate, the astonishing Maud Cuny-Hare, who I want to take a moment and talk about because of her importance to both in conjunction with the magazine and also independently of it. Cuny-Hare was born in Galveston, Texas, studied piano at the New England Conservatory of Music, and afterward returned to Texas to teach at the Deaf, Dumb, and Blind Institute for Colored Youths before eventually settling in Boston, where she met then Harvard student Du Bois at an exclusive Black music salon at the home of the important civic leader, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. For what it's worth, in his autobiography, Du Bois wrote that when he met Cuny-Hare, "I fell deeply in love with her and we were engaged. And though they never married, they remained close friends and confidants until her death in 1936. Cuny-Hare was consistently identified herself as a musician and an author. In addition to her performances as a concert pianist, she was a pioneering scholar of Creole music and sea shanties who bridged ethnomusicology, musicology, and journalism, actively publishing her work and producing a critical edition of Creole songs that she transcribed while doing field work in Louisiana. She gave lecture recitals that focused on African-American music history, and her 400-page magnum opus, Negro Musicians and Their Music, was a comprehensive history of Black music stretching from Africa to the 1930s. By then, Cuny-Hare had already edited an anthology of poetry and authored a biography on her eminent father, Norris Wright Cuny, and Skip is editor of a series that published modern editions of both of her books. And in 1927, she founded the Allied Arts Center, a Black targeted but interracial organization for Boston youth, inspired by the popular theater movement in Russia and the Little Theater movement in the United States, pursuing what Cuny-Hare called experimental studies through artistic collaboration. Rewinding to the 19-teens, some of the material for Negro musicians and their music was surely gathered through Cuny-Hare's work for the crisis. In this full-page photograph, Du Bois prominently credited her as the magazine's music writer and editor, meeting the music notes in Along the Color Line and The Horizon during these years, which do focus predominantly, though not exclusively, on the activities of concertizing musicians, were mostly curated and written by Cuny-Hare. It also means that in using the crisis to chronicle her own nonstop activity as a performer, scholar, and public intellectual, she effectively wrote herself into history. or at least into the possibility of having her history written. That isn't to say there weren't other hands involved. For instance, the music of the Masters ad and the handy feature feel more like Dill's and Du Bois's territory. But as of now, the evidence suggests that at least until 1922, when the Horizon changed its format, CUNY Hare was the musical brains behind Du Bois's Crisis Throne, in a less expansive version of the role filled by contributing literary editor Jesse Fawcett. One of the things that's been really most striking to me as I've studied crisis coverage of music during what I'll call the Du Bois CUNY Hare regime is the relentless focus on the work of Black composers. We see this in the Black Swan and Music of the Masters ads, and in the WC Handy feature that I highlighted earlier, but also in CUNY Hare's work beyond the magazine, including this enterprising colored composers concert in Boston in 1912, with music exclusively by Black composers performed by Black musicians. This is also a good example of how CUNY Hare, the contributing editor, reported on herself. On the left is the write-up of the concert in the New York Age, and on the right is what's surely CUNY Hare's own report in the crisis. In the straw fire of racial reckoning following the murder of George Floyd, music presenting organizations made a conscious and admirable effort to offer programs and even entire concert seasons featuring Black composers. But we read in the crisis that this was an active endeavor in the 19-teens. Here are just a few examples of other all-Black composers concerts at Carnegie Hall, in Chicago, and in Houston that were reported on in the crisis. And we could add to these what was, to me at least, an extraordinary amount of similar activity in these years, ranging from professional recitals to school concerts to amateur music clubs to community sings, all with the express purpose of performing music by Black composers. And as with the Music of the Masters ad, the ready-made label classical music didn't always adequately account for a lot of what audiences heard. A review of the Carnegie Hall concert, for example, observed that the program would appeal to a wide variety of musical taste, from the taste that is wholly pleased and satisfied by ragtime to the taste that finds delight in the artistic use of musical material. And I'd like to take this observation even a step further and say that one of the most impressive things about many of the musicians I'm coming across and learning about is their versatility as composers, as performers, and as professionals. One example of this is someone I'm guessing most of you have never heard of, Will H. Dixon. And I'll admit that I didn't really know about Dixon until I came across his name in the crisis as one of the composers on the program at a concert by a Black orchestra in Washington, D.C. He was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, migrated with his family to Chicago, then moved to New York in his 20s to take advantage of the happening musical theater scene there as a musician and a songwriter. And he got his big break as part of, or at least his earliest break, as part of an act called the Memphis Students. Here's a photo of the troupe with Dixon, the frenetic dancing conductor who was the forerunner of Cab Calloway, in the middle wearing a dark shirt. And the mixed bag of performers on this 1905 bill tells us that their act was made for vaudeville. They'll also notice that the show's title, Songs of the Black Folks, surely references Du Bois' recently published book. The Memphis Students were a 20-piece string band that played highly syncopated music with a comedic affect but symphonic precision, while at the same time, which is pretty incredible, singing in 4-part harmony. And though they were active for only a year or two, in his book, Black Manhattan, James Weldon Johnson vividly remembered them as the first modern jazz band ever heard on a New York stage and probably on any other stage. At the same time, Dixon aspired to be a composer of both popular music and concert repertory. So I want to play a couple of examples that invite us to think about how he and other Black musicians at the time negotiated the field of possibilities. First, I'll play a recording of a march Dixon published around the time of his work with the Memphis Students called Dance of the Bugs. And it's heard here in a later arrangement featuring white banjo specialist Fred Van Epps. And as you'll hear, Dance of the Bugs structurally and especially rhythmically is very influenced by ragtime. So you hear a lot of these rhythms like ta-da-ta-ta, ta-da-ta-ta, or ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, or ta-da-da-da-da-da, ta-da-da-ta. So those are kind of baked into a tune like this. Those motifs kind of announce to the listener that they're kind of in the world of ragtime. And the piece is structured in what's known as strain form, which just means that Dixon has written a series of short musical units called strains, ordered like a string of pearls, often with repetition and recall. The second example is Dixon's Parisian Waltz, Breath of Autumn, published as a piano piece in 1913 and arranged that same year for a full orchestra. It's also in strain form with a sequence of contrasting self-contained tunes, but its languid lyrical tune feels like it's from another world. So first, here's Dance of the Bugs. Strain A. B. Thank you. Strain C and 50. Okay, so that's Dance of the Bugs. And a couple years after this recording, Dixon published Breath of Autumn, a waltz very similar in mood, or very different in mood, that begins with this stark introductory harmonic sequence. And rhetorically, it feels almost like an exordium that announces the piece's more serious intentions. So here's the beginning of Breath of Autumn. Strain B. So the exact same structural concept, but the musical materials themselves give it a very different feel. Dixon also composed tangos that achieved popularity in its lifetime. Tango was one of the most popular musics in the world in the early 20th century. But his obituary when he died at 38 said, his chief aim in recent years was to secure the production of an opera to which he had written both the libretto and the score. So Dixon is another musician who possessed impressive range and ambition, but who also, yet again, exemplifies the fluidity between popular music and concert music in the work of these multilingual professional musicians. And even if their legibility can be blurred by the reception histories of style and genre, as a music historian, I'm fascinated by the challenge of trying to discern how Dixon or the Invincible Four or Joseph Douglas or even CUNY Hare thought about and strategized their professional lives and careers as musicians. Careers that, because of the restrictive racial ideologies that they had to navigate, can appear as improvisational as the jazz soon to come. I want to highlight one final musician I've learned about who I think it's helpful to think about in these terms. Daisy Tapley is yet another remarkable but pretty much forgotten figure who bridged the worlds of classical music and musical theater, but more importantly was instrumental in cultivating an expansive musical scene in early 20th century New York. This is Tapley as the pitch woman on the back cover, on a back cover crisis ad for a beauty product that identifies her as New York's favorite contralto and vocal instructor. She was originally from Michigan, but as a teenager moved to New York, where she joined the company of the musical comedy team of Williams and Walker. This is a 1904 photo of the Williams and Walker cast that performed the landmark musical In Dahomey, which Tapley, with Tapley circled, standing right behind Burt Williams. But Tapley was most respected and appreciated in her day for her own endeavors in New York, which were covered regularly in the crisis. In addition to being an in-demand soloist and a member of this highly acclaimed Dream Team quartet with Hayes, Burley, and Minnie Brown, she was a pianist and organist, a composer and arranger, a choral director, a booking agent who introduced Black Hat Manhattan and Brooklyn to nationally known African-American classical musicians, and an impresario who produced an innovative series of what she called educational recitals that combined performance and lectures. For instance, this pairing of a vocal and piano program with a talk by Du Bois. Sound media historian Tim Brooks has even conjectured that Tapley may have been the first African-American woman to make a commercial record when she recorded the hymn I Surrender All as a duet in 1910, her only recording. She was also very involved in social work, using music education to support young women and girls in the New York area. One of the New York-based community choirs that Tapley directed was the Negro Singing Society, which she presented in 1922 at a Carnegie Hall benefit concert for the Manassas Industrial School for Colored Youth in Northern Virginia, founded by the emancipated slave Jenny Dean. As you can see, Tapley conducted the choral portions of the concert, and the program that she put together included a set of Black religious folk songs, spirituals, perhaps arranged for chorus by Tapley, piano pieces from Magnolia Suite and In the Bottoms by our Nathaniel Dett, another set of Black folk songs, here work songs mixed with spirituals, soprano aria from Samuel Coleridge Taylor's popular cantata trilogy, The Song of Hiawatha, a group of numbers subtitled Showing the French Influence with 3 Creole folk songs from New Orleans, and the last 2 of them were from CUNY Hare's collection, a pair of spirituals and a more elaborate choral arrangement by Burley, a piece by Dett for mixed chorus and tenor solo music in the mind, another choral folk song arrangement, this one by J. Brosman Johnson, 2 of Coleridge Taylor's 24 Negro melodies, which were traditional Afro-diasporic tunes arranged for piano, a rousing choral ode for mixed voices by Burley with words by Anna Julia Cooper, art songs by Burley and Dett, and to close the program, Dett's still popular anthem, Listen to the Lambs. So what Tapley created through her artistic, organizational, and curatorial talents was a concert on the Carnegie Hall stage featuring yet another program of music by Black composers played by Black musicians, performing repertory ranging from arrangements of Black traditional tunes to art song of a cantata and choral showpieces in a benefit for a Black industrial school. So it's been continuously rewarding to learn what figures like Tapley and others were up to. And these were accomplished and ambitious early 20th century African Americans who pursued deeply textured musical lives and careers while often being leaders in their variously constituted communities. And among a lot of these figures, there's probably no getting around cultural hierarchical biases, class tensions, and utilitarian relationships to classical music being some part of the story. But I find myself in agreement with the perspective of pianist and scholar Samantha Ege communicated in her explanation of what motivates her exciting new work on Florence Price and Black women musicians in New Negro Renaissance Chicago. Ege said, I'm not looking necessarily at Price as the first Black woman within an all-white realm. I'm not looking at moments when these women surfaced in the mainstream. I'm recognizing the values of the communities that they were building themselves, and that this is the center of my narrative. It's not a counter narrative to the white mainstream, it's its own narrative worthy of celebration and elaboration as well. And I see this world making that Ege describes in a lot of what I'm learning, in the making of careers to allow for what the broader musical world couldn't imagine, but also in the building of Black institutions to sustain these endeavors. It was important work, it was race-proud work. Unless we paint too unproblematic a picture, it was also hard work. I was quite moved by a 1926 letter in which CUNY Hare, suffering from poor health, short on funds, and worn out from the constant hustle of pursuing her remarkable but ad hoc and underpaid music endeavors, wrote from Boston to her old friend Du Bois in New York to inquire about more reliable options. She wrote, "My dear Du," which is what she called him, "I'm looking forward for work which I must have immediately. Is there anything I can do on the crisis, either in the office or at this distance? Temporary work at a stated salary is my present need, and my services ought to be worth that of a high school graduate's demand. It may be that there's no place for me in the colored world, and that I'd best turn my efforts in the opposite direction. That I must decide, that I must soon determine. An article now and then is not sufficient to meet the present emergencies, so I'm looking for regular work, even though it lasts but a short period." I'm not 100% sure about what CUNY Hare meant by the opposite direction. Did she mean sticking with classical music, but working within the quote unquote white world? Or did she mean reorienting her musical focus to engage with African American communities on different terms? Either way, her existential concern with finding a place in the world through her work as a musician seems to be a metaphor for the ambivalent place of many figures during this period in the historiography of Black music in the United States. So in closing, I guess I'll leave you with two very preliminary takeaways. The first is that the work of these musicians in all its parameters needs to see the light of day. This means continued publication of modern playable editions and performances, because so much of this music by Black composers are still in manuscript or simply unheard by audiences. The Florence Price Renaissance has been thrilling, but as a group of colleagues and I joked at a workshop a few years ago, there's more than flow. But by work, I don't only mean composition. As musicologist Tammy Kernodle said recently, institution building was rooted in the notion of creating a self-directed, Black-controlled infrastructure that focused on the promotion of Black culture and history, the building of community, and the empowerment of that community. So by illuminating the work of these figures, I also mean highlighting the making of an institution building that these musicians undertook through concert programming, producing scholarship, building the still flourishing music programs and ensembles at HBCUs, founding and running music conservatories and settlement houses, launching music publishing and record businesses, operating invincible concert companies, and community organizing. The lives, activities, and aspirations of the Black musical figures we study almost always exceed the complexity of the stories we tell about them. So if Uplift was one project, and it undoubtedly was, it was just one of many. Second, in thinking about music in the crisis, thinking about music in the crisis could be a model for thinking about Du Bois's significance in a more dialogic and less mono-authorial way. One of the things that terrified me about taking on a project about Du Bois was that his output as a writer is so immense, and faithfully accounting for his views seemed like an ante into the game. But my reading thus far, more than anything, the crisis seems important for how it rallied a diverse array of variously affiliated race men and race women of its time. Race music usually designates the Black performed and Black marketed blues, jazz, and religious recordings produced in the interwar years by a segregated music industry, performances designated as representations of authentic musical Blackness. But by accounting for the largely unaccounted for musical activity that the crisis took as its mission to document, whether or not we call it classical music, We might also think of race music as simply the musical expression of the self-identifying race music, race men and race women of any particular historical moment. So when considering Du Bois's relationship to music, we might recognize the convening of Black musical people that his magazine facilitated and the making of a less acknowledged form of race music pursued by African Americans, in a sense, through the Du Bois nexus, yet still on their own terms. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll look forward to any feedback or questions you might have. Stop sharing as well, too.
Wow, man, that was fabulous.
Thank you.
That was amazing. I mean, full of stuff that I didn't know there was a concert at Carnegie Hall in 1914. Did you, Dwight? You know, it looked like Black people just be hanging out at Carnegie Hall. No, it was so rich. And the idea that, I mean, it just gave me a great idea, which is a graduate student could write a PhD dissertation on what was then along the color line. You know, the monthly history of the race. I mean, that was brilliant, just brilliant. Did you say, well, one, everybody wants to know about Maud Cooney Hare. They're too polite to ask. So I want to know why they didn't get married. Because Du Bois had about 1 million lovers. And for him to say he actually loved this woman is like astonishing, right? So I want to hear about that. But at the beginning, did you say the name Swan Records came from Du Bois?
Yes, he came up with the idea. It was the Black Swan was named after Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, who was a Black concert soprano in the 19th century, and her nickname was the Black Swan.
Right.
So he told, originally Pace was going to call it Pace Phonograph Company, and he said, no, you need to call it Black Swan.
Well, he also, you know, the role of the swan in Wagner, in, you know, Du Bois is obsessed with that opera.
Yeah.
How do you, Lohengrin? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, that's the music heard in Of the Coming of John. That's the,
yeah, right. Yeah. And for Du Bois, that was almost the summa of aesthetic perfection, that Wagner, that particular opera. And because he comes back to it again and again. And so I didn't know if the Swan had double signification for it, but
it could. I hadn't thought about that because he was a Wagner freak and he loved that opera. But I hadn't thought about the Wagner connection. That's really interesting.
So tell us about Maud. Maud is my daughter's name. Maud. They're 3 generations of baptized by Dwight Andrews. So I think she was really baptized, but I'm not sure. Well, I won't know till the judgment day. But Dwight also did my first marriage. When I got divorced, I was hoping that he wasn't really a minister and saved me a lot of money. But unfortunately, every month, I'm sorry, I can't. Yeah, break it down, Mark.
Well, it's interesting because I don't know why they didn't get married, but you know, it's interesting. Du Bois with musical women, because he fell in love with Maud Cooney Hare. He had, for I don't know when it was, but an affair with another really important woman who was in Louisville and Chicago, Mildred Bryant Jones, who was a really important musical figure. Apparently they were romantically involved, and she was reported on in the crisis as well too. And of course, his second wife was Shirley Graham Du Bois. So he really, I don't know, let's just say he loved music in more ways than one, I guess. But I don't know what happened.
I thought I heard you said Du Bois played musical chairs with his lovers, but that's not what you said. I'm hard of hearing over here. I got a bad connection, Dwight. Tanya, yeah, I don't know.
It is interesting. It is interesting though that Maud, they stayed so close. Their correspondence is really interesting. I mean, there are people who know more about Du Bois here than I do, but I don't know how much attention's been paid to his correspondence, but his correspondence is so interesting, especially not so much for the letters he writes, but for the letters people write to him, because people are writing to him, bouncing ideas. Maud Cuny here, when she's working through the idea for the Allied Arts Center from beginning to end, I want to talk about this idea and I want to do this. So people are kind of using him as a sounding board. So you get a really interesting, same thing with Black Swan Records. I mean, that was totally set up and orchestrated with Du Bois. They basically set up a plan. Du Bois had plans like, okay, in February, I'm going to have an article on the phonograph record and how we need a thing like Black Swan. And then in March, I'm going to have an article on Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, the Black Swan. And then in April, your releases are going to come out. So he was working really closely with Harry Pace and orchestrating that whole endeavor.
That's great. This is going to be a book. I mean, from what to what? What, just from the 1910 to 1934, Du Bois's editorship of The Crisis?
Yeah, I think that the idea is, I guess, a couple different ideas. I mean, one, I would like to write a book on kind of the coverage of music and the crisis, kind of organized thematically. I mean, the question of music. And I mean, what's interesting about Du Bois is that he's thinking of music as an aesthetic object, and the idea of aesthetic transcendence is really important to him. That's really what Of the Coming of John and that whole concert hall scene was about. But that's just one aspect, I think. You also get the question of music as training. So education, the relationship of music to education is interesting. And that's a bridge discourse between him and Booker T. Washington, because music was one of the academic departments at a lot of these industrial schools. Music as social work. He was on the board of the settlement house, the Black settlement, the music settlement house in New York. Music as a business endeavor and his relationship with Pace. So I can see music at the center as a way of accessing a lot of different aspects of Du Bois's thought. But there's also some. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm interrupting you. I apologize. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and there's just also other kind of smaller stories. His relationship with Samuel Coleridge Taylor, which is really interesting from a Black Atlantic standpoint. So there's just a lot of stories that come up. I would love to have a database. I mean, I have more stuff than I can ever use, but as you say about grad students, kind of get the data I'm gathering into some form that if someone's looking for a dissertation topic, there would at least be some leads for them to follow. So that's another idea, but.
Yeah, well, we could probably help with that. Like we can talk about that offline. I mean, you could apply for a research grant and, we give them from time to time. But I would be interested in supporting that because that excites me. Of course, music was one of the arts, and the arts and the aesthetic were very important in the polemics of the New Negro, that somehow not the attainment of arts, but the production of the arts would be another front in the civil rights movement. In fact, the ultimate front for Alain Locke, and to some extent for a while for Du Bois. But this goes back to a conversation you and I have had a couple of times in the colloquium, in passing, which is what kind of music. Du Bois was not listening to the blues and jazz. He wanted, though he canonized the spirituals, and basically the last chapter of The Souls of Black Folk is an anthology it's like the Norton anthology of spirituals. He goes, these are the 10 greatest spirituals, right? Because I said so. But he didn't say this is the 10 greatest piece of ragtime, and he wouldn't have said these are the 10 greatest piece of the blues. So I'm just interested in, did he ever become more embracive of what he would have thought of as vernacular forms like blues and jazz? Are you that far along in your research yet?
Well, I think that's what's interesting about The Crisis, and kind of what I was saying at the beginning is that, whatever he thought of blues, Mamie Smith was on the pages of The Crisis. Whatever he thought of blues, Black Swan was some of their first releases, were Katie Crippen, were blue. I mean, yes, there were ballads, but also blues. And I think the reason why Black Swan was so interesting to him was that not so much that he was a fan of blues, and I'd be interested to know more about his perspective on that and how he covers that. But I think that his whole thing was, I don't want to get rid of the blues, but I just don't want the only representation of Black people to the world to be ragtime and the blues, that there are also other, we might disaggregate African Americans and say, what if we have a record label that had the blues alongside Verdi arias or Burley spirituals? I think that's what excited him about Black Swan, the kind of multivalence of the label. So yeah, in some ways it's two different conversations. What were Du Bois's tastes, and what did he kind of allow to be under the umbrella and be kind of amplified within the context of the crisis?
Thank you. Tanya, do you have a comment or question?
Yeah, it's just more of a comment in terms of conversation. Just keeping in mind that right now I'm just firmly rooted in Latin America, specifically in Brazil, in terms of my thinking about Black aesthetics, and I plan to come back to the United States eventually. But first, I just can't wait to read your work, especially because, again, just in reflecting back to the conversation that we had last week, it's such an important piece in terms of documenting, I think, the many ways that, and this is, again, I'm working through this, and this is more like a comment conversation kind of thing than I have a really well thought out idea about this. But it exposes so many tensions, like the tension of, do Black folks completely assimilate into a Eurocentric vision of the modern West, or do we double down on this sort of like Afrocentric version of it? The ways in which African cultural legacies continue to be an embarrassment in many ways, for a certain segment of the Black elite, and all of those like sort of cultural legacies represented or manifested in full force in the South, right? And so even thinking about the women who were singing blues and just what they were singing about in the beginning and how that just was not cool, right? I think it's just mapped onto these things. So it's really interesting to me to see how some of these artists, these composers, are still in conversation with Africa or African cultural legacies, or at least thinking about it, right? Like, it's still there in this particular moment in history, in our history here in the United States. And so, and at the same time, you still can't hide the contradictions, right? In the sense of that sort of like African Eurocentric one, because I really admire how you include women in this, right? It's not just like separate, like now I'm going to talk about the ladies, but it's actually included, like Black women have always been a key part in these processes. And that to me is kind of something that points to how Black people are seen as non-normative, right? Black women being these thinking subjects that at the end of the day, at least within the Black community, are respected. So anyway, those are just like all these thoughts that were just coming up, because to me, it just seems like it can be so important in terms of making the kind of connections throughout the hemisphere that I keep trying to make with the US Southeast in particular, and telling my colleagues in Brazil or Cuba or Colombia, like, yeah, okay, it's great you go to Chicago and Harlem, but you need to go to Biloxi. So anyway, I just wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Johnny. I would love to talk to you more about this. And I think, two things you said that are so important is, one, I think you're right about the role in women in this. The one thing that has been revealed to me looking at this is just how central women were as the builders of what was possible for Black music making on so many levels, as concert presenters, but on the ground in communities. And it's just, and as intellectual architects, as in the case of Tapley and CUNY here. So that's really important. I think also your point about the kind of getting beyond the US frame, the part of the crisis title that's important to remember is a record of the darker races. So I think even in Along the Color Line, he's writing mostly about, or not he is, but the coverage is mostly of African Americans, but Cuban musicians, especially. He was so interested. The crisis could be an alternate textbook for U.S. history. That's what it's been for me. I'm just like, what was going on? It's just like, yeah, you're right. The building of the Panama Canal did matter. And that connects to ideas of the Great Migration. Oh yeah, and here's another way of thinking about World War I. And that's right. The U.S. occupation of Haiti did. All this stuff has happened. It's a completely recasting of the teens in a kind of global perspective. So you are hearing about the Philippines military bands. And so that would be a whole other story to be culled from this, is how he's thinking about, and I keep, I could feel myself continuously drawn to he, but how the magazine is really thinking in these global terms and raising those questions. So yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Thank you, James. Jim?
Thanks. That's really good. This thing is really great, Mark. I really enjoyed this immensely. It's really making me think about some new things. One thing I was going to ask you, though, thinking about Du Bois himself, and I have no idea about the answer to this question, but maybe you do, or maybe it's worth finding out, because people are contradictory often about what they think music means in a kind of public sense, but then someone might think that a certain kind of music is has a kind of regressive role. I mean, you kind of suggested that this is the only thing that we associate with Black people, as opposed to the full range. But then in other ways, they're more favorable about it. I mean, I know that Du Bois liked to dance, and he went out to dances, I think fairly late in his life, at least into his 40s. I mean, I don't mean late in Du Bois's life, because he lived a long time. But do we know what music was actually being played at these dances, what he was listening to? I mean, it might be interesting to think about that soundtrack of Du Bois's life. I mean, because I think on some levels, you run into lots of people who will say something about the meaning of jazz or blues in a certain sense, in a certain negative sense, or at least a stereotyping Black people in a certain sense, and then go out and dance to what probably in the teens could have been essentially, some variation on ragtime music in the North anyway.
Yeah, that is something I would love to dig into more, because I realize how much my presumption has been of taste, or what kind of encounters. I mean, did he ever go to the Tenderloin and listen to, because he talks about U.B. Blake in the context of Shuffle Along. I mean, he makes a huge deal, he writes a whole opinion piece on Shuffle Along, but did he go see U.B. Blake down in the Tenderloin and some of those clubs too, then, put on a disguise and, go down there? So, but I realize I have a lot of presumptions about what, I like the way you put it, Du Bois's soundtrack in a way, what kind of music kind of crossed his desk and crossed his ears. So I'd like to maybe kind of dive into that question in earnest and think about that.
You should write to David Levering Lewis. Have you read the 2 volumes yet?
Yeah, I have. And he talks a little bit about that, but in passing, and I think the letters would reveal some of that too. But yeah, I should reach out to Professor Lewis.
Thank you. Dwight? I think you have to unmute.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Taking us to church. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm in church today. Mark, I thought that was a wonderful presentation and very, very rich, and you articulated it in such an elegant and eloquent way. I really do thank you for the presentation and for the work that you're doing. And I do think it allows us a different way of looking at the intersection of music and Du Bois, and also the period that you're talking about. I had just a couple of quick thoughts, though. The first is that the organizations, the institutions that were so active at the turn of the century and into the 19-teens, the formation of the National Association of Negro Musicians, those institutions, I think, would be a great nexus to your study of the crisis, because it's the inner workings of those institutions, the Black music societies in various cities. And there were many women's societies, as you well know. But looking at the ecology of those institutions and how they interface with, say, crisis at the centerpiece, I think could be a wonderful a part of this conversation that you are working on. The other 2 impressions I had is that you know, Du Bois is not just complicated. I think there are many different lenses through which you can look at Du Bois. And so part of the issue for Black Swan and Pace is that these were very successful early Black companies, and their success was in large part due to commercial, popular music. And so it literally exacerbates the dilemma about whose song are we going to sing today as a people. And so I think that's a part of understanding Du Bois's own struggle with the economic success of the race records versus what he would like to hear. The final thing is really my question. You described these musicians in the early part of the 20th century as being incredibly versatile. They're working in theater, they're working in chamber ensembles, they're doing concerts at Carnegie Hall, and they're doing what all gigging musicians do. They have to work in different mediums across different areas, popular, classical, etc., but they have to work. And so I'm curious, given the musicians that you cited, what do you sense of today's popular music musicians? They don't necessarily, I'm curious, do you think they have the same kind of versatility, or is that simply not necessary now at the beginning of the 21st century? Because Burley and, you know, all of those guys were doing all kinds of different work to work. And I'm just wondering, do you see any difference in today's popular music ecology, I guess is the word?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I feel like I was having a similar conversation about this with someone the other day, that I do think part of it is, you know, think about what a dance band was in the teens and 20s, that really you were a jukebox, you know, so, you know, Black bands could play polkas and white bands could play the blues, but the recorded history of white and Black bands kind of encode a kind of racial segregation, that all the Black bands are only allowed to record blues and the white bands only record, you know, foxtrots. So I think there was a professional expectation that musicians be more versatile. The role of sheet music, I think, is really important too. I mean, I think a lot of musicians, like being a reading musician, meant that you actually had access to a lot of different, you just played the notes on the page, whatever the notes may be. So my instinct is that probably I think the music industry has nudged musicians to being more specialists, you know, and stylistically pigeonholed in the way that musicians might not have been in the earlier, in their active lives, even if the recorded industry, and I think that's one important thing to think about is, as I said before, like the way discographies look and the way people's careers actually looked don't necessarily map onto each other. So I suspect that there is a kind of, you know, strategic, or maybe strategic, or just kind of channeling of musicians into more specific styles as specialists. Now, of course, the, you know, studio musicians are much, you know, perhaps more versatile, that they can, and you'd know more about this than I would, in terms of what the gig is. It'd have to be more responsive. But in terms of the musicians we hear on recordings, I guess they would be a little bit more specialized than they might have been earlier in the century. I'd be interested to talk to you more about that, though, because that's interesting.
Thank you. Wendell.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, that was fascinating on so many levels, and I just really want to thank you for that talk. It actually got me thinking about a number of different things, which may or may not be directly related to your research, which is, I think, an even larger sign of how amazing that talk was. One of the things that I was thinking about was the idea of class structure as it applies to music. I am a classically trained pianist who does a lot of other things, right? And even that term, classically trained, like that's something you hear with pop musicians or singers or, you know, DJs or whatever, and they'll say, but they're classically trained, and, you know, that's sort of coded for, they have white European Western, you know, training. They can read music. If you can read music, you're a real musician. When really, you know, yes, I'm classically trained, but I'm trained in a lot of other things as well. And so that was interesting to just to sort of hear you speak about that. And sort of along those lines, I was wondering, I was looking at the two of the posters that you put up. One of them was the Black Swan ad that said every time you buy a Black Swan record, you buy the only record made by colored people. And I noticed that was dated January of 1922.
Mhm.
And then one of the Carnegie Hall program from April 3rd, 1922. And I, as a pianist, I couldn't help noticing that it said Steinway piano used at the bottom of the right page of that. And so I was just curious if you have any insight as to what companies like Steinway or other large manufacturers were doing in the early 20s in terms of promoting musicians of color at a time when they were prominently featured on these programs. I imagine that was a Carnegie Hall program that was printed, but regardless, to this day, it's if you're a pianist, you want to be a Steinway artist. So I'm just wondering if you've come across anything about that in your research. I know it's not necessarily directly related, but again, your talk got me thinking, so thank you for that. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, one more quick thing.
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to say, I'm fascinated by looking at photographs of Black musicians from the early 1900s and late 1800s, so thank you for including those.
Sure. Yeah, they're great to look at how people strategize, how they pose themselves. But the question of companies is really interesting, and I haven't dug into it. And I hadn't thought about the Steinway piano, which I suspect was kind of the house, kind of the Carnegie Hall thing. But another part of that is publishing companies. Like, I'm really interested, so Harry Burleigh or R. Nathaniel Dett, what music publishers were publishing music by Black composers. Some were and some weren't, and what was their calculus? Now, some were publishing perhaps popular songs, and they might have been more derogatory songs like coon songs, but others were, Burleigh had a standing arrangement, Dett had a standing arrangement with some of these publishers. So that's really interesting to think about, like, what was I like Dwight's term of ecology. What was the ecology of publishing companies who made strategic decisions to publish Black composers or not? So that's something I do want to dig into. The other thing you said, which I think is so important and I want to think more about, is the question of training. And you're right, that classical training usually connotes some sort of musical literacy. But it would be interesting to kind of disaggregate even those quote unquote classically trained musicians, because some of them went to conservatories like Maud Cuny Hare, like Helen Hagen, like J. Rosamond Johnson, Will Marion Cook. Some were kind of self-taught, like Abby Mitchell, like one of the people in that Memphis Students ad with Will Dixon was Abby Mitchell, who went on to be the first Clara in Porgy and Bess, which means she premiered and was the first to record Summertime. She wasn't classically trained, but she had this operatic voice, and so she could kind of be an opera singer just by almost an intuitive way. And there's people in between who just didn't go to conservatories, but who sought out lessons I need to be an arranger and I need to know this thing in order to be able to enact this task. So even within that category of classically trained, there's actually quite a range of really different strategies, which I think is interesting to think about. So yes, I'd love to, follow some of those leads and start divvying things up further. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you. Atulu?
Okay, so thank you so much, Mark, for this fascinating talks. That was really wonderful. I really appreciate it. And you may already know, you may surmise that I'm interested in discussing a little bit more about all this because I learned a lot. And I think there is much more to learn. And I'm excited about the possibility of discussing this in depth with you. So I just have a couple of questions. First, I would like to know if you're aware of the last book of by Lindsay Stewart, which is called The Politics of Black Joy, because it is this had been published in 2021. So in that book, there is a chapter on the Du Bois moniker concerning the Negro spirituals, this very idea of sorrow songs. And then, but this idea permeates the whole book. It's not just in the chapter, but because Stewart challenges this moniker of Du Bois, and relying on the Zora Neale Hudson and the distinctions he draws between resistance on the one hand and refusal on the other. She argues that this categorization of Du Bois doesn't suit the Negro spiritual, and then we had to look at these songs and to this particular genre as different from what Du Bois said about the Negro. So I was interested first in knowing that first, if you may be convinced by this argument. Second, if this applies to Negro spiritual as well, because from what I've seen and for what I've heard from your talk, this doesn't apply at all, because what Stewart is arguing doesn't fit with what I've seen of Du Bois' activities, especially in the crisis. But do you have any thoughts about that? And would you say if Stewart is true, is right, is correct? Would you say it's just regarding the Negro spirituals, or would that apply to all the other styles of music as a whole? Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I just froze in the middle of Adulo's question, so I missed the very end. Right when you started talking about Zora Neale Hurston is right when I.
Okay, so let me just repeat what I've just said. So Zora is arguing, but there's a piece of the answer provided by Dwight just before you arrived. So I was asking if you would agree with the idea of Stewart that we should distinguish between resistance and refusal and classify this particular way of approaching the spirituals as sorrow songs in the resistance rather in the refusal. I guess it would not really suit to what you've said, because according to what I've discovered, because all these things were really new to me, this classification would rather put Du Bois on the side of the refusal, which is opposed to what Stewart is saying. But I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And if you think that Stewart is correct and in saying that Du Bois' classification of Negroes put him on the side of the resistance rather than the side of refusal, would you say this applies as well to the other styles of Black music, or just restricted to the area of Negro spirituals?
Yeah, I would say that, I think Du Bois is interested in a few different things, and all these musicians. I think there is the even calling them sorrow songs and documenting. Because even in the sorrow songs essay, he's looking back, he's remembering his grandmother. He does this in a few places, remembering his grandmother singing these songs from Africa, and how the spirituals are serving a similar function. So I think there is certainly an element of memory that he sees in these spirituals, that they have a kind of commemorative function. I think that's really important. But I also think that the question of nation building is really important to Du Bois, and I think nation building in the cultural nationalist sense of what would a distinctively Black school of composition look like, but also nation building in terms of citizenship. What would an American school of music look like? So I think the spirituals, what's fascinating is that they serve a lot of functions. It gets really complicated, I think, especially, and Skip mentioned a while ago, Dvorak, the Bohemian composer, who said that a great and noble school of American music could be built on the spirituals. It's complicated because on the one hand, Black composers are kind of doing that. And don't forget, Du Bois was trained in Germany too. So that whole cultural nationalist, romantic nationalist gesture of the 19th century, he was steeped in that and saw kind of using the spirituals in that way as kind of part of that. At the same time, there's also this, and this is one thing I want to explore, but there's also a kind of ethnographic, kind of new folkloric, academic view of folk songs, thinking about their function. CUNY Hare, this goes back to Tanya's point, CUNY Hare was traveling to the Caribbean and the West Indies to study folk songs. So she was really interested in that kind of Afro-diasporic thing. But also don't forget the Old South is part of this too. So the spirituals also signify this kind of, these plantation melody. So it's a very complicated thing. On the one hand, building a kind of school of composition. On the other hand, it can be kind of a Faustian bargain in terms of using them. And they were mainly used by white composers. I mean, in some ways, what Dvorak did is give white composers permission and encouragement to use spirituals as the basis of concert music. So I think that, you know, thinking about the work that the spirituals are doing, it's operating. So resistance and what was the other one you said?
Refusal.
Resistance and refusal. But I think there are a lot of other uses to which the spiritual is put, sometimes progressive and sometimes less so.
Thank you so much.
There's a new book about Dvorak and Black music. It just came. I haven't read it yet, but it was reviewed in the Times.
Joseph Horowitz, Dvorak's Prophecy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Christopher Lehman.
Well, thank you, Mark, for a great presentation, and it's great to see you again.
Yeah.
My question has to do with venues. In your research, did you find that Du Bois was especially concerned about segregation in certain venues, such as theaters or concert halls? Did you find that he was concerned about who would be hearing the music that he was championing in the crisis?
That's such a great question, and absolutely. I mean, it's a constant preoccupation of Du Bois, the idea of segregated entertainment, about the building of Black venues. He's right. Almost every issue has, you know, such and such amusement company has built a new Black theater in Baltimore. The Dunbar Theater is built in Philadelphia and DC. He's really interested. And I think the reason why theaters were so interesting to him, and he does this gesture, and in fact, Of the Coming of John does this idea, this encounter of racism in the concert hall, right? This kind of moment where the experience of aesthetic transcendence is kind of collides with the kind of, you know, blunt force trauma of these kind of ugly racial encounters. And I think he was intrigued with the co-presence of the possibility of artistic experience and racism. He often he would say, you may mind I'm here, but Shakespeare doesn't, or, you know, I'm here for Beethoven, not for you, kind of thing. So the presence of art and society, there's something about a particularly laboratory that he saw the theater, and that working out that space, whether it means creating your own spaces or kind of attacking segregation of the spaces. So I think venue mattered a lot to him. I think there was something about the publicness of the theater and the opportunity for shared aesthetic experience that was really meaningful to him. So yeah, that's something I want to look at a lot more closely, but I think it was really important to him. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I learned so much. I just got one, I think it's a big question, but simple question. This is 1910 to 1934 you're looking at. So can you sort of mark out any shifts in the way that he thinks about music that might be related to the shifts of his political stances or relationship to Harlem Renaissance? Do you detect any sort of shifts in what you read in the crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen. I'm only halfway through. I'm right at that point where I would expect to see either a shift or a digging in of his heels, because right in the 20s, I mean, so I would say that kind of in the historiography of Black music from, say, the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War II, typically it congeals, or our attention, it congeals around three peaks: the kind of Fitzjubilee singers in the 1870s and early 1880s. Then we jump ahead to the turn of the century with the birth of ragtime and musical theater in New York. And then we leapfrog ahead to the late teens and 20s. And it's easy to overlook that Harlem Renaissance period, just, the first jazz records, the vaudeville blues divas of the 20s, the country blues singers like, Charlie Patton and Blind Leopard Jefferson in the late 20s, the birth of the modern gospel movement in the early 30s. There's a lot of stuff that happens in that late. So I'm really interested in this kind of just before jazz period. Like how does he confront the enormous popularity of Black popular music in the 1920s? So I'm like right at that point. So your question is kind of a cliffhanger, because I think that if we're going to see a shift, I think we start to see a shift with Black Swan, because I think he sees Pace's strategy of pairing a label that both come for the blues, stay for the classical kind of thing, is the way Harry Pace kind of sets up his record label. So stay tuned. But maybe by the time I leave, I'll have a better answer to that. But I think that he is having to navigate, not just transcendent aesthetics, but also kind of popular appeal as part of his outlook on music.
Michael's subtext is, as he moved to the left, did his taste in music move to the left? That's what that question was all about. Yeah, he was listening to some Marxian blues.
Those popular front socialists in the 30s, that swing was their soundtrack. So I don't know if it was for him, but it was for people, for others.
No, that's great. I'm sorry, I got to go. We're heading to New York, then flying to LA. So you guys stay on. Mark, fabulous. Really, I'm so excited. I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions or comments? If not, I think we'll end here. Thank you so much, Mark, for
Thank you very much.
fascinating
Thanks everyone for your
presentation.
questions. Appreciate it.